What if I told you the most powerful figures in the ancient world weren't just kings or generals, but tax collectors? These weren't mere bureaucrats pushing paperwork. They were innovators, power brokers, and even inventors of the very currencies we still use today. Picture this: a Mesopotamian tax collector 5,000 years ago, standing in a sun-baked courtyard, accepting bundles of barley as payment. But instead of just stuffing grain into storerooms, he did something revolutionary. He issued a clay tablet, a receipt that could be traded like money. That simple act changed the course of history. From the dusty markets of Babylon to the marble halls of Rome, tax collectors didn't just collect wealth, they designed it. They transformed barley into ledger entries, lumps of metal into coins, and trust into economic systems that spanned continents. These were the shadow architects of civilization, weaving networks of trade and power while kings took the credit. Ever wonder why we call it currency? The word itself whispers their legacy, flowing like a river, connecting distant lands just as they once did. So why does this matter to you? Because every time you swipe a credit card or glance at a price tag, you're touching the fingerprints of these ancient strategists. Their innovations, standardized weights, stamped coins, even early forms of banking, built the invisible scaffolding of our modern world. And here's the twist: their stories are buried under layers of time, dismissed as dry history. But peel back those layers and you'll find tales of ingenuity, corruption, and occasionally redemption. Ready to meet the unsung masters of money? Let's journey back to where it all began. To understand how tax collectors became so powerful, we have to look at the very foundations of civilization itself. In Mesopotamia, around 3,000 years before the Common Era, the world's first cities were rising from the fertile land between two rivers. But cities need organization, and organization needs records. Enter the tax collector. These weren't just bean counters with styluses. They were often priests, scribes, and trusted advisors who understood that counting grain was just as important as growing it. Picture a temple scribe in Ur, carefully pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay, each stroke recording not just taxes paid, but the entire economic heartbeat of the city. These early tax collectors did something brilliant. They turned physical goods into written promises. A farmer might pay in barley, but that barley could be stored in temple granaries while the farmer received a clay tablet proving his contribution. That tablet could then be used to pay debts or trade for other goods. Suddenly, tax collectors weren't just moving food. They were moving trust, creating the first forms of credit and laying the groundwork for banking. In Egypt, the system was even more sophisticated. The Nile's predictable floods meant wealth could be measured in advance, and tax collectors worked like human calculators, tracking everything from baskets of wheat to jars of olive oil. But their real power came from their role as the pharaoh's eyes and ears. They knew which villages were thriving, which were struggling, and exactly how much could be demanded without sparking revolt. When a new pyramid needed building, it was the tax collectors who ensured the labor and materials flowed smoothly. What made these figures so indispensable? They weren't just taking, they were building systems, standardized weights, fair measures, reliable records, all innovations that made trade possible beyond simple barter. And with that trade came influence. A tax collector in Babylon might negotiate with merchants from as far away as India, while one in Athens could fund entire naval campaigns by reorganizing how silver was collected. Their power wasn't just in what they took, but in what they made possible. The leap from collecting sacks of grain to minting the world's first coins didn't happen by accident. It was born from sheer necessity. Take Lydia, that wealthy kingdom in ancient Anatolia where tax collectors faced a problem: how to move vast amounts of wealth without hauling endless carts of grain, livestock, or precious metals. Their solution: small, portable discs of electrum, a natural mix of gold and silver, stamped with the king's emblem to guarantee their value. Suddenly, a soldier's pay could fit in his pocket, a merchant's debt could be settled with a handful of coins, and yes, taxes could be collected without turning palaces into overcrowded storehouses. But here's what's fascinating: these early coins weren't just money, they were propaganda. Every stamp bore the face or symbol of a ruler, a constant reminder of who held power. Tax collectors didn't just distribute these coins, they controlled their flow, carefully monitoring how much entered circulation and where. In doing so, they became the invisible hands shaping Lydia's economy, turning scattered transactions into a unified system. Meanwhile, in Han Dynasty China, tax collectors faced a different challenge: moving taxes across thousands of miles without wagons of heavy metal. Their innovation. Promissory notes, early paper money. A merchant in Chengdu could deposit coins with a local official, receive a printed note, and present it to another office in the capital to reclaim the value. It was safer, faster, and utterly revolutionary. But the real stroke of genius: the government quickly realized these notes didn't even need to be fully backed by metal reserves. As long as people trusted the system, the paper itself held value, a concept that echoes in every modern banknote today. What tied these innovations together? The same relentless drive to solve practical problems. Tax collectors weren't sitting in dusty offices dreaming up economic theories. They were knee-deep in the messy reality of feeding armies, funding cities, and keeping empires afloat. When barter systems collapsed under their own weight, they invented coins. When coins became too cumbersome, they created paper promises. Each solution was a stepping stone to the next, building the financial foundations we still rely on. And let's not forget the human element. Behind every stamped coin or ink note was a tax collector making judgment calls, deciding who got credit, whose goods were valued fairly, and when to bend the rules. Some used their power corruptly, yes, but others saw themselves as stewards of stability. In Rome, for instance, meticulous tax records helped distribute grain during famines. In India, advanced accounting systems kept trade flowing along the Silk Road. These weren't just clerks, they were the unsung engineers of prosperity, turning chaos into order, one transaction at a time. Imagine holding a piece of clay the size of your palm, etched with strange symbols. To us, it might look like a child's doodle, but 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, that humble tablet was as good as gold. Temple tax collectors didn't just record grain deposits, they invented the very idea of money as a concept. Here's how it worked. A farmer delivers barley to a temple granary, and instead of hauling sacks to market, he walks away with a baked clay receipt. That receipt could be broken into smaller pieces to pay workers, traded for pottery, or even used to settle debts. Suddenly, grain wasn't just food, it was a financial instrument, its value locked into that fragile rectangle of mud. What made this system revolutionary wasn't just convenience, it was trust. Those temple receipts carried the weight of divine authority, literally. Many bore the seal of a god, making them the ancient equivalent of a central bank's guarantee. Traders from distant cities accepted them without question, creating a network of commerce that stretched across the Fertile Crescent. And here's the twist: tax collectors became the first bankers, issuing loans against future harvests. A merchant might borrow 20 barley receipts to fund a caravan, repaying 25 after the next harvest. Sound familiar? It's the same principle behind modern loans and interest. But the real genius lay in the unintended consequences. As these receipts circulated, they evolved beyond their original purpose. Some were even marked as non-transferable, an early form of paycheck, ensuring only the named worker could redeem them. Others functioned like futures contracts, promising delivery of specific goods by certain dates. The system grew so sophisticated that by the reign of Hammurabi, laws regulated receipt fraud with brutal precision. Forgery that meant losing a hand. The legacy of these clay tablets echoes in every digital transaction today. When you check your bank balance, you're not staring at piles of cash. You're looking at numbers representing stored value, just like those ancient grain accounts. Even stock certificates and cryptocurrency operate on the same foundational idea, a token standing in for something tangible. The Mesopotamians proved that money isn't about the material, it's about the story we collectively agree to believe. And who wrote that story? Tax collectors, armed with nothing but wet clay and a vision of commerce that would outlast empires. The bustling markets of Sardis, Lydia's capital, hummed with a new kind of energy in the 6th century before the Common Era. Traders no longer haggled over uneven lumps of metal or weighed out handfuls of grain instead. They passed small, gleaming discs stamped with roaring lions and cryptic symbols. These weren't just pretty trinkets, they were the world's first standardized coins, and they changed everything. Lydia's tax collectors faced a logistical nightmare. The kingdom sat at the crossroads of Asia Minor, where trade routes converged, and the old barter system was collapsing under its own weight. How do you tax a merchant carrying spices from India, Egyptian linen, or Greek olive oil when no one agrees on what anything is worth? Their solution was elegant. Take the naturally occurring electrum found in their rivers, a mix of gold and silver, and shape it into uniform pieces, each bearing the king's seal. That stamp wasn't just decoration. It was a promise, a guarantee that this coin held a specific value, backed by the full authority of the state. Suddenly, tax collection transformed. Instead of hauling wagons of grain or livestock to royal storehouses, merchants could hand over a pouch of coins. Soldiers could be paid in something that fit in their belts. Even everyday transactions became faster, no more arguing over whether 3 chickens equaled 1 bronze pot. But the real power of coins lay in their psychology. That official stamp tapped into something deep in human nature, trust. A farmer might not know a foreign trader, but if they both accepted the king's mark, they could do business. The system spread like wildfire. Greek city-states adopted it, then Persia, then the entire Mediterranean world. Coins became more than money, they were tiny ambassadors of Lydia's influence, circulating far beyond its borders. And here's the twist, the very electrum that made these coins valuable also revealed the tax collector's cunning. Natural electrum varies in gold and silver content, so Lydia's minters learned to adjust the ratios, creating lighter or heavier coins as needed. It was an early form of monetary policy, though not always honest. Some rulers couldn't resist diluting the mix, sparking history's first episodes of inflation. Yet the legacy endured. Those lion-stamped discs set the template for every coin in your pocket today. They proved that money isn't about the material, it's about the story we all agree to tell. And in Lydia, that story was written by tax collectors who realized that standardization wasn't just about efficiency. It was about building an empire on the most persuasive idea of all, trust made tangible. Rome's tax collectors didn't wear uniforms or work in government offices. They were businessmen, entrepreneurs who saw taxation as the ultimate investment opportunity. Known as Publicani, these were no ordinary bureaucrats. They formed powerful syndicates, pooling resources to bid at public auctions for the right to collect taxes in far-flung provinces. The highest bidder won, but here's the catch: Rome didn't pay them a salary. Instead, the Publicani kept whatever they could collect beyond the contracted amount. That system turned taxation into a high-stakes gamble where profit depended on squeezing every last denarius from the populace, and squeeze they did. In the provinces, the Publicani became both feared and despised. Armed with imperial authority but driven by private greed, they employed ruthless tactics, charging arbitrary fees, inflating assessments, even seizing property when payments fell short. The system was rife with corruption, yet undeniably effective. The silver denarius, Rome's iconic coin, flowed into their coffers, funding everything from legions to lavish public baths. But the real brilliance lay in how these tax farmers reinvested their profits. They didn't just hoard wealth, they built the arteries of empire. Roads that stretched from Britain to Egypt, aqueducts that quenched thirsty cities, harbors that welcomed trade ships, all funded by the very taxes they extracted. The denarius itself was a masterpiece of economic engineering. Unlike Lydia's electrum coins or Mesopotamia's clay tablets, this silver piece carried the face of living rulers, a constant reminder of who held power. The Publicani didn't just distribute these coins, they controlled their circulation, ensuring taxes were paid in Roman currency, which then reinforced its dominance. Provincial merchants had no choice but to adopt the denarius, weaving Rome's economy into a unified web. Sound familiar? It's the same strategy behind modern reserve currencies, where economic might dictates global trade. Yet for all their efficiency, the Publicani sowed the seeds of Rome's discontent. Overreach sparked revolts, like the infamous uprising in Judea, where oppressive taxation fueled rebellion. Even Cicero, Rome's great orator, railed against their excesses. But here's the paradox: their very ruthlessness stabilized the empire. By funneling wealth into infrastructure, they created the conditions for prosperity. Roads meant trade, aqueducts meant cities could grow, and security meant more taxable subjects. The system was brutal, but it worked. The echoes of their model linger today. When private contractors collect tolls or manage public utilities, when governments outsource tax enforcement, even when central banks manipulate currency flows, we're seeing the ghost of the Publicani at work. Their legacy isn't just in coins or ledgers, but in the enduring idea that taxation isn't merely about revenue. It's about power, control, and the invisible machinery that keeps civilizations running. The Silk Road wasn't just a path for camels and caravans, it was a financial superhighway, and the tax collectors who operated along its routes were the unsung conductors of a vast economic symphony. Picture a bustling oasis town where a Sogdian merchant from Samarkand haggles with a Chinese silk trader. Neither speaks the other's language, and their coins bear different emperors' faces. Enter the tax collector, part linguist, part banker, who assesses the value of the goods, calculates the owed duties, and does something extraordinary. He invents an exchange rate on the spot. A bolt of silk might be worth 10 Roman denarii here, but only 8 cushion drachmas there, and he's the one who makes the math work. These middlemen didn't just move goods, they moved value itself. In Dunhuang, a gateway between China and Central Asia, tax collectors kept dual ledgers, one for silk measured in rolls, another for silver weighed in taels. When a Persian trader paid duties with a stack of Byzantine gold solidi, the collector might melt some down to mint local currency, creating a hybrid coin that bore hints of both empires. It was financial alchemy, turning confusion into common ground, and their innovations went deeper. Some issued handwritten chits, early travelers' checks, that could be redeemed at the next major outpost, sparing merchants from hauling heavy metal across deserts. The real genius of these systems lay in their flexibility. A tax collector in Taxila, near modern-day Pakistan, might accept payment in Indian punch-marked coins, Bactrian silver, or even bolts of Parthian wool, whatever kept trade flowing. They weren't bound by rigid rules, they were improvisers shaping solutions to fit the moment. When the Han Dynasty demanded taxes in standardized copper coins, collectors along the Tarim Basin devised a workaround. They'd accept local goods, sell them for copper elsewhere, and forward the proceeds. It was globalization in action, centuries before the word existed. But their role wasn't just practical, it was diplomatic. A shrewd tax collector knew when to bend the rules to avoid offending a powerful caravan master, or when to enforce them to remind a distant province of imperial authority. In Palmyra, that glittering crossroads of cultures, tax records show transactions in Greek, Aramaic, and even Sanskrit, each line a testament to the delicate balancing act of keeping everyone happy enough to keep trading. What does this mean for us today? Those Silk Road intermediaries mastered a truth we're still grappling with. In a connected world, rigidity breaks systems. Their hybrid currencies and fluid exchange rates were the ancient equivalent of modern financial instruments like special drawing rights or cryptocurrency bridges, tools designed to span gaps. When a collector in Merv accepted a bale of Turkic felt as partial payment for a Chinese porcelain shipment, he wasn't just settling a debt. He was proving that value isn't absolute, it's negotiable, shaped by context and consensus. The Silk Road didn't just transport silk and spices, it carried ideas about how money could work when cultures collided, leaving behind a playbook for navigating the messy, magnificent intersection of commerce and human ingenuity. Imagine carrying 50 pounds of copper coins strapped to your back just to pay your taxes. That was the exhausting reality for Tang Dynasty merchants and farmers in 7th century China. The empire's economy was booming, but its currency system was stuck in the Bronze Age. Coins were bulky, easily stolen, and impractical for large transactions. Enter the tax collectors who stumbled onto a solution so simple it would reshape global finance: paper. At first, these weren't banknotes as we know them. They were humble deposit certificates, scraps of paper issued by merchants in Sichuan who stored coins for clients. But tax collectors noticed something brilliant. Instead of hauling sacks of coins to the capital, they could accept these paper promises, saving weeks of dangerous travel. By the time the Song dynasty took power in the 10th century, the system had evolved into something extraordinary. The world's first government-issued paper money. The jiaozi, printed with intricate designs and anti-counterfeit seals, wasn't just a tax tool, it was legal tender for everything from silk to salt. This shift did more than lighten merchants' loads. It shattered the ancient link between money and metal. For the first time, value wasn't tied to a physical object you could weigh or melt. It existed purely because the government said it did. The birth of fiat currency. The Song dynasty even standardized denominations, creating 10-coin and 100-coin notes that functioned much like today's bills. But the real masterstroke, tax collectors enforced the system by refusing to accept old, worn-out coins, pushing paper into wider circulation. Yet paper money's greatest strength was also its vulnerability. Without the discipline of precious metal backing, the Song government couldn't resist printing more notes to fund wars and luxuries. Inflation spiraled, and by the 13th century, it took stacks of jiaozi to buy what a single note once could. The lesson was clear: trust in paper requires restraint, but the genie was out of the bottle. Marco Polo would later marvel at Chinese money made from the bark of trees, spreading the idea along trade routes to Europe. What's astonishing is how prescient these tax collectors were. Their system anticipated credit cards, digital banking, even cryptocurrencies, all forms of money that exist as abstract agreements rather than tangible objects. Every time you tap your phone to pay for coffee, you're channeling their revolutionary insight. Value isn't in the thing itself, but in the collective belief we assign to it. The Song dynasty's experiment ultimately collapsed under mismanagement, but the principle endured. Paper money proved that finance isn't about metal or paper. It's about the invisible threads of trust that bind an economy together, threads first woven by tax collectors tired of counting coins. In the heart of Constantinople, where the Golden Horn met the Bosphorus, a new kind of financial wizard was reshaping the ancient world's economy. These were the trapezites, Byzantium's banker tax collectors, who turned marble counting tables into the empire's financial nerve centers. Unlike the ruthless Publicani of Rome or the temple scribes of Mesopotamia, the trapezites operated at the intersection of public duty and private enterprise. Picture a bustling exchange near the Great Palace, where a merchant from Alexandria could deposit silver bullion in the morning, secure a loan for a spice shipment by noon, and insure his cargo against storms before sunset, all under the same vaulted roof. The trapezites didn't just collect taxes, they monetized them. When imperial taxes flowed in as grain or silk, these savvy operators converted them into gold numismata, the empire's stable currency, then lent those coins back out at interest. It was a self-reinforcing system. Taxes funded liquidity, liquidity fueled trade, and trade generated more taxable wealth. Their ledgers tracked everything from vineyard revenues in Thrace to the fluctuating value of Syrian glassware, creating an early form of financial intelligence. But their real innovation was risk management. A trapezite might advance funds to a shipowner with the loan secured by the cargo itself, an ancient version of collateral. If the ship sank, the loss was shared. If it arrived safely, both parties profited. Some even offered what we'd now call derivatives, allowing merchants to lock in prices for goods before they reached the market. These weren't just loans, they were the building blocks of modern finance. The trapezites' influence stretched far beyond Byzantium's walls. Their system of currency exchange, meticulously calculating rates between gold numismata, Islamic dinars, and European silver, laid groundwork for medieval banking hubs like Venice. Even their name echoes in finance today. The Greek trapeza, meaning table, evolved into the Italian banco, giving us the word bank. What made them truly revolutionary was their dual allegiance. Unlike modern banks, which serve private profit, or tax agencies focused solely on revenue, the trapezites balanced both. They stabilized the empire's finances while greasing the wheels of commerce. When a plague emptied Constantinople's coffers in the 6th century, it was trapezites who restructured debts to keep businesses afloat. When foreign merchants hesitated to trade in unfamiliar currency, trapezites vouched for conversions. Their success proved that financial systems thrive when public oversight and private ingenuity intertwine, a lesson we're still relearning today. The next time you deposit a paycheck or check an exchange rate, remember, those marble tables in Byzantium were the testing grounds for ideas now taken for granted. The trapezites didn't just count coins. They proved that money, at its best, isn't just a tool, it's a bridge between stability and opportunity, between empires and everyday lives. Deep in the vaulted archives of ancient Memphis, an Egyptian scribe dipped his reed pen into ink, carefully noting each sack of grain that arrived at the pharaoh's granary. This wasn't just bookkeeping, it was the dawn of accounting as we know it. These scribes, often serving as tax collectors, developed systems so precise they could track a single loaf of bread from harvest to distribution. Their papyrus scrolls recorded not just quantities, but dates, sources, and even quality assessments, creating an early version of the audit trail. The real breakthrough came with double entry, not on Renaissance ledgers, but along the Nile. Tax collectors would mark grain received on one side of a papyrus sheet. then note its allocation on the other, balancing the two. This simple act of matching inflows and outflows became the backbone of modern accounting. Imagine a world where every transaction left two marks, one for what was given, one for what was taken. That fundamental idea still governs every balance sheet today. Rome took this further. Provincial tax collectors kept not one, but three separate ledgers: the Codex Accepti for revenues, Codex Expensi for expenditures, and the Tabulae Rationum that reconciled the two. Officials could cross-reference these records to catch discrepancies, a practice that would make any modern accountant nod in recognition. The system was so robust that when Cicero prosecuted the corrupt governor Verres, he didn't just present witness testimony, he demanded the tax ledgers, knowing their meticulous entries would reveal the truth. What's often overlooked is how these accounting methods shaped governance itself. In Persia, the Achaemenid cylinder seals served as both tax receipts and early fraud deterrents. Only an official with the matching seal could authorize transactions, creating a primitive but effective control system. Meanwhile, in Han Dynasty China, tax collectors used color-coded strings to track different revenue streams: red for land taxes, blue for trade duties, a visual system that predated modern spreadsheet tabs by 2 millennia. The legacy of these ancient accountants isn't just in techniques, but in philosophy. Their records weren't merely about catching cheats, they were about building trust. When a Mesopotamian temple published its grain accounts on clay tablets for all to see, it was sending a message: this system is fair. That notion, that transparency underpins economic stability, resonates in every financial disclosure today. From the auditor's signature on a corporate report to the blockchain verifying a cryptocurrency transaction, we're still chasing that same ideal, first etched in clay by tax collectors who understood that numbers, at their best, don't just add up, they speak truth. Beneath the gleaming marble of Rome's forums and the bustling markets of medieval towns, a darker truth lurked. Tax collection wasn't always about innovation or public service. For every scribe meticulously balancing temple ledgers, there was a publicanus in the provinces, squeezing farmers for every extra denarius he could pocket. These weren't just administrators, they were opportunists who turned imperial authority into personal profit. Take the case of Verres, the infamous governor of Sicily, whose tax collectors demanded double the official rates, then pocketed the difference. When farmers couldn't pay, they seized land, livestock, even children as collateral. Cicero's scathing prosecution speeches laid bare the system's rot, tax collectors acting less like civil servants and more like armed brigands with the full weight of the law behind them. The backlash was inevitable. In Judea, oppressive Roman tax policies fueled the zealot revolts, while in Britain, Boudicca's uprising was sparked in part by predatory loans tied to tax collection. But Rome wasn't alone in this struggle. Medieval Europe's tax rolls tell similar tales, like the 1381 peasants' revolt in England, where collectors enforcing the hated poll tax were dragged from their homes and executed. These weren't mindless riots. They were desperate reactions to systems that prioritized revenue over fairness. Even the tools meant to ensure transparency, like detailed tax codes, could be weaponized. Byzantine farmers faced assessments so convoluted that only well-connected collectors could interpret them, always to the debtor's disadvantage. Yet within these failures lay hard-won lessons. The Abbasid Caliphate, for instance, pioneered independent audit offices to rein in corrupt collectors, while Tang Dynasty China rotated tax officials frequently to prevent local entrenchment. The most effective systems shared a common thread: checks on power. Venice's tax councils required multiple signatures for assessments, and Islamic treasuries employed sworn witnesses to verify collections. These weren't just bureaucratic innovations, they were safeguards against human nature's darker impulses. The irony, many of history's most despised tax collectors started as reformers. Rome's Publicani began as efficient contractors who streamlined chaotic provincial systems, but without oversight, efficiency curdled into exploitation. Their legacy whispers a warning: we're still learning. Any system that divorces power from accountability invites abuse. Modern tax havens and offshore loopholes are just the latest chapter in an ancient story, one where the line between civic duty and predation blurs whenever watchful eyes look away. In the sprawling Persian Empire, tax collection wasn't just about filling royal coffers. It was the glue holding together history's first superpower. The satraps, those provincial governors appointed by the king, weren't merely administrators. They were power brokers who controlled both the sword and the purse. Picture a satrap in Babylon, seated in a palace lined with lapis lazuli, weighing tribute from caravan merchants one moment and deciding troop deployments the next. Their tax rolls doubled as intelligence reports, revealing which regions thrived and which simmered with discontent. A surplus might mean loyalty, a shortfall could signal rebellion. The system was ingenious. By tying wealth to governance, Persia turned tax collectors into the empire's eyes, ears, and fists. But this fusion of fiscal and political power came with risks. When a satrap like Orots in Lydia grew too rich, he could defy the central court, even assassinating imperial officials with impunity. The Achaemenid kings countered this with brutal efficiency. Royal inspectors, the eyes of the king, would descend without warning, auditing ledgers and loyalty in equal measure. A satrap who hoarded silver or skimmed taxes might find himself flayed alive, his skin stuffed and displayed as a grisly warning. Yet the balance was delicate. Push too hard and satraps would revolt, too softly and the empire frayed. This dance between central authority and regional autonomy echoes in modern federal systems, where tax collection still tests the limits of power. The Persian model wasn't unique. In Ptolemaic Egypt, the Duoikites chief tax administrator often held more sway than generals. Cleopatra's survival during Rome's civil wars hinged not just on charm, but on her ability to deliver Egypt's legendary grain taxes on time. Meanwhile, in ancient India, the Mauryan Empire's Arthashastra texts prescribed tax rates down to the last mango tree, but also warned kings. Overtaxing farmers risked emptying both granaries and thrones. These weren't just economic calculations, they were survival strategies. A Han Dynasty official put it bluntly in a memorial to the emperor: "The people are like water, the state like a boat. Water can carry the boat but also overturn it." What's startling is how these ancient dynamics mirror modern politics. When Byzantine emperors granted tax exemptions to influential landowners, they weakened the treasury while strengthening aristocratic rivals, a precursor to today's lobbying for tax breaks. The Inca Empire's mitre system, where labor substituted for taxes, built Machu Picchu but also fueled resentment that Spanish conquistadors exploited. Even the Magna Carta's famous clause limiting arbitrary taxation traces back to barons rebelling against King John's predatory collectors, the thread connecting these stories. Tax collectors who became kingmakers didn't just move money, they shifted allegiances. A satrap financing mercenaries, a medieval tax farmer bankrolling a claimant's bid for the throne, or a Renaissance banker funding wars with interest-bearing loans, all understood that control over revenue streams meant influence over who ruled. In our era of corporate lobbying and campaign finance, the players have changed, but the game remains eerily familiar. The next time you hear debates over tax policy or corporate loopholes, listen closely. You're hearing the latest verse in a very old song, one where gold and power have always danced together, with tax collectors calling the tune. In Jerusalem's Second Temple, a simple coin carried divine weight, the half-shekel temple tax. Every Jewish man, whether a fisherman from Galilee or a merchant in Alexandria, was required to contribute this exact amount each year. But here's what's fascinating: these weren't just any coins. They were minted from pure silver, free of graven images to comply with religious law, and bore inscriptions like Holy Jerusalem in ancient Hebrew. The money changers Jesus famously overturned weren't just opportunistic traders. They were essential intermediaries, swapping Roman denarii stamped with pagan emperors for these sacred shekels. This system wasn't just about piety. It was a meticulously designed financial network that funded temple operations, sustained the priesthood, and even provided for the poor. The Islamic world took this fusion further with zakat, one of the 5 pillars of Islam. Unlike arbitrary levies, zakat was a precise 2.5% of one's accumulated wealth, a spiritual duty with mathematical rigor. Tax collectors here weren't just bureaucrats. They were community stewards, redistributing wealth to orphans, travelers, and the indigent. But the real innovation was in the currency itself. Early Muslim states minted gold dinars and silver dirhams with Quranic verses, creating money that was both legal tender and a declaration of faith. These coins didn't just facilitate trade. They spread Islamic identity across 3 continents, their inscriptions serving as miniature sermons in metal. Buddhist monasteries in Tang Dynasty China operated on a similar principle. Pilgrims donated not just coins but rice, silk, and even land taxes of gratitude rather than obligation. These contributions were meticulously recorded on temple scrolls, with interest-bearing loans offered to farmers in times of famine. The line between alms and economic activity blurred so completely that some monasteries became de facto banks, their vaults overflowing with donated treasures that funded everything from bridge repairs to medical dispensaries. What tied these systems together? The understanding that money, when sanctified by purpose, could transcend mere commerce. A medieval Christian tithe might fund a cathedral's soaring arches, but it also paid for the village midwife. Hindu temple taxes collected in the form of gold ornaments weren't just stored. They were melted down during droughts to buy grain for the starving. Even the Maya used cacao beans, a currency blessed by the god of merchants, to pay both market vendors and temple priests. The brilliance of these sacred currencies lay in their dual nature. They satisfied earthly needs while elevating transactions beyond the transactional. When a Muslim merchant paid zakat on his profits, he wasn't just settling a debt. He was weaving himself into a divine economy of care. When a Jewish family scraped together their half-shekel, they weren't just funding a temple, they were buying into a collective identity that outlasted empires. These weren't taxes in the modern sense. They were covenants written not on parchment but in silver and gold. Picture a world where buying bread required hauling a chicken to market, or where a farmer needing tools had to find a blacksmith who just happened to want his surplus barley. Barter worked in small villages, but as empires grew, tax collectors faced an impossible task: how to measure the value of 100 different goods flowing into storerooms. The solution didn't come from kings or merchants. It came from the scribes holding styluses, who realized that tracking actual sheep, jars of oil, or bundles of reeds was as impractical as counting grains of sand. Their breakthrough was deceptively simple. Instead of moving physical goods, they moved information. A clay tablet from Mesopotamia might record that a farmer delivered 30 measures of barley to the temple. That tablet could then be broken into smaller pieces, each representing a portion of the grain, and traded like currency. Suddenly, a potter could accept a sliver of clay as payment, knowing it could be redeemed for real barley later. This wasn't just a receipt, it was an early form of money divorced from the chaos of barter. Coins took the concept further. When Lydia stamped its electrum discs with official marks, it solved two problems at once. For tax collectors, coins meant no more haggling over whether 10 chickens equaled 1 goat. For everyone else, they offered something barter never could: liquidity. A coin could buy bread today, a cloak tomorrow, or be saved for taxes next season. Its value wasn't tied to the whims of supply and demand. It was fixed by authority, making trade predictable. But the real death knell for barter came from an unexpected quarter: military payroll. Roman soldiers couldn't be paid in sheep or wheat. Armies needed portable, uniform value. The denarius became the perfect tool, spreading Rome's monetary system wherever legions marched. Merchants from Gaul to Egypt soon learned that dealing in coins was faster than barter, and tax collectors insisted on them, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. Once people saw currencies as more reliable than bartering a sack of onions for a pair of sandals, there was no going back. The irony: barter never truly disappeared. In times of crisis, like when Rome's coins were debased or during medieval coin shortages, people reluctantly returned to swapping goods. But tax systems always pulled economies back to currency. When the Tang dynasty required taxes in copper coins, farmers had to sell crops for cash, forcing markets to standardize. Money, it turned out, wasn't just more convenient than barter. It was the lifeblood of complex societies, and tax collectors were the ones who kept it circulating. In the shadow of history's grand tax collectors, kings, merchants, and bureaucrats, lies an overlooked force: women who shaped economies with quiet authority. Take the Kingdom of Meroe, where queen mothers didn't just advise rulers, they held the keys to the treasury. These kandaks, as they were called, weren't figureheads. They supervised tax assessments on gold mines, negotiated trade tariffs with Rome, and even minted coins bearing their own profiles. When a Roman envoy once tried to bypass Meroe's customs duties, it was Queen Amanianas who famously blocked his caravan, sending a message etched in economic defiance: no one skipped taxes under her watch. Mesopotamia tells a similar story. In the temple complexes of and Uruk, priestesses like Enheduanna, history's first-named author, didn't just perform rituals. They managed vast storehouses of grain, oil, and textiles, issuing clay tablets that functioned as tax receipts and credit notes. These women weren't mere record keepers, they were financial architects. A tablet from Lagash reveals how the priestess Shagshag calculated interest on barley loans with precision, her scribes noting every transaction in cuneiform. What made their role possible? In societies where temples doubled as economic hubs, divinity and debt collection intertwined, a priestess's sacred authority lent legitimacy to her ledger, turning tax collection into an act of cosmic order. Even in patriarchal systems, women found ways to influence fiscal policy. Ptolemaic Egypt's tax rolls list female vineyard owners and weaving workshop managers who negotiated their own tax rates. A papyrus from Oxyrhynchus details how a woman named Aurelia Tisus petitioned Roman officials to adjust her land assessment, proving her case with meticulous harvest records. And in the Indus Valley, seals bearing female names suggest women oversaw trade networks that fed into tax systems. These weren't exceptions. They were threads in a larger tapestry of economic participation. The most surprising revelation: some of history's earliest currencies may carry feminine fingerprints. Scholars argue that cowrie shells, used as money from China to West Africa, gained value partly because women controlled their distribution in many cultures. In medieval Mali, oral traditions speak of Dia's female tax collectors who accepted gold dust measured by weight, their fairness renowned across the Sahara. When patriarchal narratives rewrote these stories, the economic power of women was erased or recast as domestic rather than systemic. What does this mean for our understanding of ancient finance? It shatters the myth that tax collection was a male-dominated affair. From the barley fields of Sumer to the gold routes of Nubia, women didn't just participate in these systems, they refined them. A priestess's tablet, a queen's coin, or a merchant's petition reminds us that financial innovation has never been gendered. The real ledger of history, when read carefully, shows balances and exchanges far more complex than we've been taught. Consider Alexander the Great's march across Persia, an empire so vast it stretched from Egypt to India. His secret weapon wasn't just disciplined soldiers or brilliant tactics. It was a network of tax collectors trailing his army like a second supply line. Every conquered city meant new treasuries to seize, but also new systems to exploit. Alexander's genius, he left local tax structures intact, simply redirecting the flow of silver from Persian kings to his own war chest. The same bureaucrats who once funded Darius's palaces now paid for Macedonian spears. But here's the twist: war didn't just consume money, it reinvented how money worked. When Rome's legions pushed into Gaul, they didn't just demand tribute in cattle or grain. They imposed taxes in Roman denarii, forcing entire regions to adopt the conqueror's currency. Suddenly, a blacksmith in Britannia needed coins to pay his taxes, so he sold his wares to soldiers who paid him in those very same coins. It was a self-perpetuating machine. Taxes created demand for currency, and currency fueled the armies that enforced taxation. The Mongol Empire took this further. Their Yam courier system, originally built for military communication, doubled as a tax collection network. Horsemen racing between outposts didn't just carry orders, they transported silver ingots and silk as tribute. When Kublai Khan needed to fund his invasion of Japan, his solution wasn't just raising taxes. He issued paper money backed by nothing but imperial decree, an idea so radical it would take Europe centuries to catch up. War drove him to invent fiat currency. Even failures bred innovation. During the 30 Years' War, German princes desperate to pay mercenaries began debasing coins, mixing cheap metals with silver. But when people refused the worthless currency, tax collectors adapted. They demanded payment in specific goods like timber or iron, then sold those materials to fund armies. It was an early lesson in fiscal triage. When money collapses, tax systems revert to barter, but with a bureaucrat's precision, the most revealing case. The Byzantine themata system. Instead of paying soldiers in gold, the empire granted them tax-collecting rights over specific lands. A legionary might not see a salary, but he could keep a portion of what he gathered from farmers. This turned troops into tax farmers, tying their loyalty directly to the state's revenue stream. The downside, when the system frayed, soldiers turned into warlords, bleeding the provinces dry. What war taught tax collectors was simple: necessity mothers invention, but desperation fathers recklessness. Every military campaign from Caesar's Gaul to Napoleon's Europe forced fiscal creativity, whether through standardized currencies, emergency levies, or outright confiscation. Yet these innovations often outlasted the wars themselves. The gold florins minted to fund medieval battles became the backbone of Renaissance trade. The bonds issued to finance the Crusades evolved into modern government debt. Even today, when nations raise defense budgets, they're walking a path paved by ancient tax collectors who proved one enduring truth: empires rise and fall, but the machinery of funding war never stops evolving. The golden denarius that once fueled Rome's empire began to crumble long before the barbarians breached the gates. As political instability gnawed at the empire's foundations, tax collectors faced a nightmare: coins so debased with cheap metal that merchants refused to accept them. The once proud silver denarius, stamped with the emperor's profile, dwindled to a copper core with a thin silver wash. Farmers who once paid taxes in reliable currency now found their coins rejected, forcing them back into the chaos of barter. A sack of grain might buy a day's labor, but only if the laborer needed grain that day. The system that had unified an empire collapsed into a patchwork of local trades, and the Publicani, Rome's infamous tax contractors, faded into irrelevance, their ledgers gathering dust in abandoned villas. Yet Rome's decline wasn't unique. Along the Silk Road, the Mongol conquest shattered centuries of financial interdependence. When Genghis Khan's horsemen burned trading cities to the ground, the delicate web of credit and promissory notes that had spanned continents unraveled overnight. Tax collectors in Samarkand, who once balanced accounts in Chinese silk and Persian silver, now bartered for survival. A merchant's carefully hoarded stack of paper money from the Song dynasty became worthless when the bureaucrats who backed it were slaughtered. The Mongols themselves had no use for these systems. Their wealth was measured in horses and loot, not ledger entries. What linked these collapses? A vulnerability baked into the very nature of state-backed money. From Rome's denarius to the Islamic dinar, currencies invented for tax collection relied on one fragile assumption: that the powers enforcing their value would endure. When governments weakened, so did trust in their coins. Byzantine emperors facing invasion clipped gold from their numismata, hoping no one would notice. Medieval kings diluted their silver pennies to fund endless wars. Each debasement eroded confidence, pushing economies closer to barter. But here's the paradox: while empires fell, the ideas behind their currencies refused to die. In the ruins of Roman Britain, villagers still counted in denarii long after the last coin was minted, using the term as a unit of account for bartered goods. Along the fractured Silk Road, merchants clung to the Suyu system, a ghost of paper money, where debts were recorded on scraps of cloth until stable governments returned. These weren't just habits, they were proof that the principles of standardized value outlived the empires that birthed them. The real lesson lies in resilience. After the Black Death emptied Europe's coffers, tax collectors in Venice and Florence didn't revert to cattle or grain. They doubled down on banking innovations, creating letters of credit and bills of exchange that would seed the Renaissance economy. When the Ming dynasty abandoned paper money after hyperinflation, they didn't abandon the concept, they refined it, laying groundwork for later systems. Even the Mongols, who initially scorned paper currency, eventually adopted it under Kublai Khan, realizing no empire could function on loot alone. What separates the currencies that vanished from those that evolved? The answer lies in adaptability. The denarius died because it was tied to a single empire's glory, but the clay tablets of Mesopotamia, the promissory notes of Song China, the gold dinars of Islam, these survived in spirit because they solved universal problems. They weren't just tools of tax collection, they were answers to the human need for trust across distance and time. When political storms uprooted one system, the seeds of another were already taking root elsewhere, watered by the same timeless necessity: the need to turn chaos into order, one transaction at a time. Medieval Europe's tax collectors faced a puzzle no ancient bureaucrat had encountered: a continent fractured into countless fiefdoms, each with its own weights, measures, and makeshift currencies. Picture a royal tax agent riding into a French village, only to find the local lord demanding payments in chickens, the church collecting in sacks of rye, and the blacksmith accepting nothing but iron bars. In this chaos, the solution wasn't stamped coins or clay tablets, but something far humbler: sticks of wood. tally sticks, those unassuming pieces of hazel or willow, became the backbone of feudal finance. Here's how they worked. A tax collector would notch a stick to represent a debt, say 5 shillings owed to the crown. The stick was then split lengthwise, with one half kept by the debtor and the other by the king's exchequer. When payment came due, the two halves were matched like a puzzle. No literacy required, no coins needed, just wood grain aligning to prove legitimacy. It was a system so foolproof that England's royal treasury used it until the 19th century, with some sticks still lingering in archives today. But tally sticks were just the beginning. In the absence of strong central currencies, tax collectors became improvisational economists. Some accepted payments in ghost money, abstract units like the French livre that existed only on paper, allowing villagers to convert chickens into theoretical values. Others embraced the warehouse receipt model, where grain stored in castle granaries could be traded like currency, much like those Mesopotamian clay tablets millennia earlier. The real innovation, though, came from Italy's merchant bankers. When feudal lords needed to pay distant mercenaries, these bankers issued letters of credit, early checks, that tax collectors could redeem across borders, weaving a fragile web of trust over a fractured landscape. The brilliance of these systems lay in their adaptability. A tally stick could record a peasant's wool tax as easily as a king's war debt. A Venetian ducat, minted from silver looted from Constantinople, might circulate from English tax coffers to Egyptian spice markets without losing its value. Even the humble notched stick had a dark side, though. When England's King Henry Roman II ordered a mass audit, the famous Domesday Book, his agents used tallies to expose underpayments, leading to ruthless confiscations. Every innovation carried risk. What's striking is how these feudal workarounds echo today. The tally stick's split-proof design inspired modern cryptographic signatures. Warehouse receipts evolved into commodity futures markets, and those chaotic local currencies, they're not so different from municipal bonds or regional banking systems. The medieval tax collector, armed with nothing but a knife and a ledger, proved that money isn't about the material, it's about the agreement. Whether carved in wood or coded in silicon, the principle remains the same: trust verified by ingenuity. In the bustling markets of Baghdad, beneath the shadow of the House of Wisdom, a quiet revolution was unfolding, not in scrolls or star charts, but in the hands of tax collectors. The Abbasid Caliphate didn't just inherit the lands of Persia and Byzantium, it inherited their financial chaos. Coins of mismatched weights, arbitrary levies, and corrupt officials plagued the empire's early days. Then came the dinar and dirham, gold and silver coins so precisely crafted they became the medieval equivalent of a global reserve currency. But the real genius wasn't in the minting, it was in the system behind them. Every dinar bore the same weight and purity, guaranteed by the caliph's treasury. No more guessing whether a coin was clipped or diluted. Tax collectors could trust the stamp, and so could merchants from Cordoba to Canton. This standardization didn't just simplify trade, it built trust across continents. A silk trader in Samarkand knew a Baghdad dirham would hold its value in Cairo or Damascus. And here's the twist: the Abbasids didn't stop at coins. They created the first centralized tax registry, the Diwan al-Kharaj, where scribes recorded assessments in meticulous detail. Land surveys determined yields, while crop-specific tax rates ensured fairness. A farmer growing dates paid differently than one raising sheep, yet the system's brilliance lay in its flexibility. In provinces like Egypt, where grain was king, taxes could be paid in wheat but converted into dinar values for accounting. Meanwhile, border markets accepted foreign coins, only to melt them down and re-mint them into dinars, steadily unifying the economy. Even the famed postal system, the barter, doubled as a tax network, with riders carrying revenue reports and currency samples to ensure consistency. What truly set the Abbasids apart, though, was their view of taxation as a civic contract. The Caliph Al-Ma'mun famously tied tax rates to irrigation investments. If the state built canals to increase harvests, farmers paid slightly more, but everyone prospered. Philosophers like Al-Ghazali wrote treatises on the ethics of taxation, arguing that fair collection was a form of worship. This wasn't just bureaucracy, it was a moral framework woven into commerce. The results were staggering. Tax revenues funded hospitals with sliding scale fees, libraries open to all, and astronomical observatories where scholars calculated the Earth's circumference. When a merchant in Basra paid his dues, he wasn't just funding soldiers, he was underwriting the Golden Age itself. The system's collapse when it came wasn't due to flaws in design, but to the same force that topples all great systems: human greed. As provincial governors hoarded taxes and the silver supply dwindled, the trust behind those pristine dinars eroded. Yet the legacy endures. Modern Islamic finance still draws on Abbasid principles of asset-backed currency and equitable risk-sharing. The next time you see a gold standard debate or hear about blockchain's promise of transparency, remember, 8th century tax collectors were wrestling with the same ideals. They proved that money isn't just about metal, it's about the collective faith that turns an idea into an empire's lifeblood. While Eurasian empires standardized coins and paper, Africa's tax collectors mastered the art of context. Take the cowrie shells of Mali's medieval empire, tiny, glossy tokens harvested from distant Indian Ocean shores. To outsiders, they might have seemed fragile, even whimsical. But in the savannas of West Africa, cowries became the gold standard of taxation. Their value wasn't arbitrary, it was rooted in scarcity and logistics. Transporting sacks of cowries across the Sahara was so perilous that each shell carried the weight of risk, making them perfect for measuring wealth. When Mansa Musa, history's richest man, paid taxes on his legendary gold mines, even his coffers were counted in cowrie equivalents, a system so reliable it survived into the colonial era. Yet cowries were just one thread in a vast tapestry. In the Kingdom of Congo, tax collectors used massive copper crosses, some as heavy as a child, mined from the region's rich deposits. These weren't mere lumps of metal, they were ceremonial objects often shaped like axes or blades, their value tied to both utility and spiritual significance. A single cross could buy a canoe, pay a bride price, or settle a year's taxes with a local chief. Unlike coins stamped with rulers' faces, Congo's crosses bore no royal insignia. Their authority came from communal trust, not state decree. The contrasts with Eurasia were striking. Where Rome or China imposed top-down currency systems, African tax collectors often worked from the ground up. The Aksumite Empire minted coins like their Mediterranean neighbors, but in Ethiopian highlands, salt bars became the real currency of obligation. Carved from the desert's saline crust, these slabs were light enough to carry, yet indispensable for survival. Taxing salt was tantamount to taxing life itself. Meanwhile, along the Swahili coast, woven cloth lengths called kaniki served as both trade goods and tax payments, their value calibrated by the skill of the weaver rather than the whim of a mint. What unified these systems wasn't material, it was philosophy. African taxation often mirrored ecological rhythms. The Lozi people of Zambia paid floodplain taxes in baskets of fish during wet seasons and grain in dry months. In Yorubaland, taxes were sometimes collected in cowrie shells one year and woven mats the next, adapting to harvests and artisanal output. This flexibility revealed a deeper truth: money here wasn't abstract. It was an extension of the land and labor that produced it. The real innovation lay in accountability. Many African systems built in checks against abuse. The Nsimbu shells used in Congo had to be strung in exact quantities, with chiefs and taxpayers jointly verifying counts. Among the Igbo, elders audited tax collections in public ceremonies, redistributing excess to the community. Compare this to Rome's opaque Publicani or medieval Europe's arbitrary levies, and the difference is stark. African systems often prioritized equilibrium over extraction. When European colonizers arrived with their rigid coinage, they missed the sophistication beneath what they dismissed as primitive barter. A Portuguese trader might scoff at paying taxes in bolts of raffia cloth, but that cloth represented weeks of skilled labor, a value as concrete as any silver real. The tragedy wasn't that these systems were inferior, it's that their context-driven brilliance was too subtle for conquerors to see. From cowries to copper crosses, Africa's tax currencies weren't just tools. They were living ledgers of ecology, culture, and collective trust, proof that money, at its best, reflects the world it moves through. The jungles of Mesoamerica hummed with economic activity long before European coins crossed the Atlantic. But here, wealth wasn't measured in gold or silver. It was counted in cacao beans, woven cotton cloaks, and glimmering jade beads. The Aztec Pochteca, those elite merchant spies who doubled as tax collectors, moved through city-states with carefully guarded pouches of these goods, assessing tribute not just for their emperor, but for an entire interconnected economy. A single sack of cacao beans might pay a farmer's tax, buy a slave at market, or even serve as a gambler's stake in ceremonial ball games. What made these items currency wasn't their material alone, it was the collective belief in their value, enforced by the empire's relentless demand for tribute. Unlike the standardized coins of Rome or Lydia, Mesoamerican currencies thrived on flexibility. In Maya city-states, jade beads carved into deity shapes might circulate alongside quetzal feathers and sea salt from distant coasts. The Aztecs took this further, creating a tiered system where cacao worked for small transactions, cotton quetzal cloaks served as mid-range currency, and gold dust stored in goose quills handled elite exchanges. But here's the twist, these weren't just random commodities. Each item carried layers of meaning. Cacao was sacred, tied to rituals and the god Quetzalcoatl. Jade symbolized life and power, often buried with kings. When tax collectors demanded tribute in these forms, they weren't just extracting wealth, they were reinforcing cultural touchstones that bound the empire together. The real genius of this system lay in its logistics. Without beasts of burden or wheeled carts, moving bulky goods across mountainous terrain was nearly impossible. But cacao beans could be carried in baskets, jade beads strung around a runner's neck. The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, fed by tribute from hundreds of miles away, became a living ledger of this network. In its bustling Chanquistli markets, a porter from the Gulf Coast might trade vanilla pods for oxacan cochineal dye, both items destined to become tax payments elsewhere. The marketplace wasn't just where goods changed hands, it was where value itself was negotiated, with tax collectors setting the baseline. What can we learn from these systems? That money, at its core, is a shared story. The Spanish conquistadors famously dismissed cacao beans as primitive, yet within decades, they were using them as currency in colonial mines when European coins ran scarce. The Maya's jade economy collapsed not because the stones lost value, but because the cultural framework that gave them meaning was shattered. Today, as cryptocurrencies and digital tokens redefine value once again, the lesson of Mesoamerica rings clear. Currencies don't fail when materials change. They fail when the stories we tell about them break down. The Aztec tax collector, demanding jade beads for the emperor's coffers, understood something we're still grappling with: that money isn't just what you hold in your hand. It's what everyone agrees to believe. Long before banks issued loans or credit scores existed, ancient tax collectors were already mastering the art of deferred payments, and in doing so, they invented the very concept of credit. Picture a Sumerian farmer standing in the shadow of the ziggurat, sweat streaking his brow as he pleads with the temple scribe. The harvest was poor, the river unpredictable. Could he pay his grain tax after the next planting season? The scribe, acting as both tax collector and financier, might nod, pressing wedge-shaped marks into clay to record the debt. That tablet wasn't just a promise, it was a financial instrument, its value backed by the farmer's future labor and the temple's authority. What made these systems work wasn't just bureaucracy, it was trust woven into the fabric of daily life. In Babylon, the Code of Hammurabi didn't just set tax rates, it outlined interest caps on grain loans, recognizing that excessive debt could unravel society. A merchant who borrowed silver to fund a caravan knew his reputation was collateral, default, and he might lose his standing in the marketplace long before a court intervened. The Assyrians took this further, with tax collectors maintaining trust ledgers, lists of reliable debtors whose word was as solid as stamped metal. The real innovation, though, lay in the flexibility of these arrangements. Egyptian tax collectors along the Nile advanced seed grain to farmers before the floodwaters receded, knowing the debt would be repaid from the very harvest it funded. In ancient India, the Kautilya Arthashastra described tax loans with seasonal adjustments, lower rates for monsoons, grace periods for droughts. These weren't acts of charity, they were calculated investments in future revenue. A starving farmer couldn't pay taxes, but one given a lifeline might yield crops and silver for years to come. Yet credit systems also exposed humanity's oldest tensions. Roman tax farmers, notorious for predatory lending, would seize lands from defaulting debtors, fueling unrest that echoed in the protests of the plebeians. Meanwhile, in Zhou dynasty China, benevolent administrators forgave agricultural loans after natural disasters, stabilizing regions that might otherwise rebel. The difference between exploitation and stewardship often came down to one question: was credit a tool for control or circulation? The echoes of these ancient choices surround us. When a modern bank approves a mortgage or a small business line of credit, it's standing on foundations laid by tax collectors who understood that money isn't just about what exists, it's about what could be. The farmer's next harvest, the merchant's upcoming voyage, the city's unfinished aqueduct, all were once just promises etched in clay or parchment. What made those promises hold value wasn't the material they were written on, but the unshakable belief that tomorrow's work could settle today's debts. And at the heart of that belief stood a figure we rarely thank: the tax collector, part accountant, part prophet, seeing potential where others saw only risk. The fingerprints of ancient tax collectors are everywhere in our modern financial systems, not just in the coins we jingle in our pockets, but in the invisible architecture of trust that makes global commerce possible. Consider something as routine as swiping a credit card. The moment that transaction clears, you're participating in a chain of trust that stretches back to Mesopotamian clay tablets and Song dynasty promissory notes. Those early tax collectors didn't just move wealth, they built the conceptual bridges between tangible goods and abstract value, proving that an economy could thrive on promises as much as on precious metals. Take the concept of standardized currency. When Lydia's tax officials stamped electrum coins with the lion's head, they weren't just simplifying payments, they were solving a problem of human psychology. People needed to believe in the value of what they held, and that belief required consistency. Fast forward to today, every dollar bill in your wallet carries the same unspoken pact. The green ink and serial numbers are our modern-day lion emblems, symbols of a system where trust is baked into the design. Even when money went digital, the underlying principles stayed the same. Cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, with their transparent ledgers, echo the Babylonian tax registries carved in stone, proof that transparency has always been the antidote to doubt. But the true endurance test of these ancient innovations lies in their adaptability. The Silk Road's hybrid currencies, part coin, part barter, part IOU, were the medieval equivalent of today's multi-currency payment apps. A trader in Samarkand juggling Byzantine gold and Chinese silk would have understood Venmo's exchange rate calculations instinctively. And when medieval European tax collectors embraced tally sticks, they were essentially prototyping blockchain, creating tamper-proof records without a single written word. The materials change, but the problem remains: how to move value across distance and time without losing faith in the system. Perhaps the most profound legacy is the way these early systems balanced accountability with flexibility. The Abbasid dinar's purity standards were enforced by caliphal decree, but its acceptance relied on merchant consensus. That tension between top-down control and bottom-up trust still defines modern finance. Central banks tweak interest rates, but it's the collective belief in those decisions that determines their power. When hyperinflation strikes, whether in Weimar Germany or Zimbabwe, it's not the paper that fails. It's the breakdown of the story everyone agreed to tell. So why do these ancient solutions feel so familiar? Because they weren't just solving for their own moment. They were grappling with timeless human dilemmas. How do we trust strangers with our wealth? How do we build systems that are fair but not fragile? The answers they crafted: standardization, transparency, adaptability, weren't just clever workarounds. They were the first drafts of a social contract written in silver, clay, and parchment. Every time we tap our phones to pay for coffee or wire money across oceans, we're speaking their language. The coins and codes evolve, but the conversation never really changes. Digital wallets and cryptocurrency might seem like a radical break from the past, but scroll through any blockchain ledger, and you'll find the ghostly imprint of those Mesopotamian clay tablets. The parallels are uncanny. Just as ancient tax collectors transformed sacks of barley into tradable receipts, modern systems convert labor and assets into digital tokens, abstract representations of value that only work because everyone agrees they do. Take Bitcoin's decentralized ledger. It's not so different from the Babylonian practice of etching debts into stone for public accountability, except now the stone is a global network of computers. Even the volatility of crypto mirrors the chaos of Rome's debased denarius, where trust in the system wavered with each emperor's fiscal recklessness. Central banks, meanwhile, are replaying an ancient script with a digital twist. When the Song dynasty printed paper money backed by imperial decree, they faced the same skepticism modern governments confront with central bank digital currencies. The challenge then and now: convincing people that bits on a screen or ink on paper hold real value. China's digital yuan, for instance, operates much like those Tang dynasty deposit certificates, where state authority bridges the gap between abstraction and trust. And just as Lydia's coin stamps guaranteed metal purity, today's cryptographic signatures verify digital authenticity. The tools have evolved, but the core problem remains: how to standardize trust across vast distances. Yet the most revealing parallel lies in the tension between innovation and equity. Rome's tax farmers squeezed provinces dry to line their pockets, much like how algorithmic trading can amplify wealth inequality today. But history also offers antidotes. The Abbasid Caliphate's tax reforms tied rates to infrastructure investment, ensuring communities benefited from what they paid, a model echoed in modern proposals to fund universal broadband through digital taxation. Even the Silk Road's hybrid currencies find their counterpart in today's stablecoins, which peg digital value to real-world assets to avoid volatility. What's the lesson for policymakers? That every financial revolution from clay tablets to blockchain risks leaving someone behind. Ancient tax systems collapsed when they prioritized efficiency over fairness or control over adaptability. The Mesoamericans thrived by valuing jade and cacao equally, creating a multi-tiered economy that accommodated both kings and farmers. Similarly, today's digital infrastructures must balance high-speed transactions with protections for those who still rely on cash. The real test isn't whether we can build faster systems, but whether we can replicate the resilience of those Silk Road money changers, who turned chaos into common ground with nothing but ingenuity and a keen sense of what people truly needed. The real power of ancient tax collectors wasn't just in the wealth they gathered, it was in the ideas they unleashed. Every time you tap your phone to pay a bill or swipe a card at the checkout, you're participating in systems they pioneered. Those Mesopotamian scribes pressing cuneiform into clay weren't just tracking barley, they were inventing the concept of stored value. The Silk Road money changers juggling currencies weren't mere middlemen, they were prototyping global exchange rates. Even the most mundane financial act today carries echoes of their ingenuity. Consider the receipts in your wallet. They're direct descendants of those baked clay tablets from Ur, proof that a transaction occurred and value changed hands. The coins jingling in your pocket, they owe their existence to Lydia's tax collectors, who realized stamped metal could replace barter. And when you transfer money digitally, you're channeling the same leap of faith that made Song Dynasty paper money revolutionary. The understanding that trust, not material, is the real foundation of currency. But the deeper lesson lies in their adaptability. Ancient tax systems didn't just survive, they evolved. When Roman coins became too debased, medieval Europe reinvented tally sticks. When cowrie shells lost luster in West Africa, copper crosses took their place. This resilience offers a blueprint for our own financial future. Cryptocurrencies, contactless payments, even the resurgence of barter in crisis zones, all prove that money, at its core, is a living idea, constantly reshaped by necessity. What's often forgotten is how these innovations emerged from pressure. Tax collectors didn't dream up coins for convenience. They were solving the chaos of moving armies pay across deserts. Paper money wasn't born from abstract theory, but from the Tang dynasty's desperation to lighten merchants' loads. The best financial breakthroughs weren't crafted in ivory towers. They were forged in the gritty reality of feeding cities and funding empires. That's why their solutions lasted. They worked where it mattered. So the next time you grumble about taxes, remember, the same systems that fund governments also gave us the tools to build, trade, and innovate. Those ancient bureaucrats, often maligned as greedy or corrupt, were also visionaries who turned grain into ledgers and trust into currency. Their legacy isn't just in coins or contracts, it's in the very idea that humans can create systems to share value across time and space. And that's a story worth telling, one transaction